Hello, all you headbanging heroes and heroines. It's that time once again. My name is Alan, and now let's talk metal. Tonight, I'm going to be talking a little German metal, which is something I haven't touched on before. Not really news to anybody that Germany has produced some of the best heavy metal ever, and they've done it in multiple genres. They, of course, produced some of the biggest name thrash bands of the 80s and 90s. They've produced some of the best power speed metal with bands like Halloween, Gamma Ray, Blind Guardian. The country has a long and storied history of just putting out really top-notch heavy metal of all different types. So tonight, we're going to cover a few unknown bands and some kind of semi-known bands that if you've been around in heavy metal circles for a while, you've probably come across, at least know the names, but maybe you haven't had a chance to learn much about them yet. So we'll touch base on about 7 different acts. We'll touch base on one bigger name act that sometimes gets passed by as well. So without further ado, let's get started. What got me thinking about German metal was watching the most recent video over on the Maze of Torment channel. If by chance you don't check that one out, you definitely should. It's Devin's channel. He has a really great collection of stuff, does really nice videos. And in his most recent one, he showed off an album he had recently picked up, a reissue by a German band called Iron Angel, which is sort of an old favorite. Haven't played them in years. It's one of those bands that just don't get back around to playing very much anymore. But it's like, oh yeah, that's a great pickup. And yeah, it's one of those German bands you just don't hear enough about. So that kind of got the wheels spinning a little bit. And here we are a few hours later putting this together. So, Iron Angel, I actually don't have copies of these records anymore. It's something that I traded at some point and just never got back to picking up. Shame on me. But they did a couple of albums around 85 and 86. The first one's called Hellish Crossfire, and the second one was called Winds of War. Devin did a pretty good job of describing the band in his video. They have a very strong Maiden Priest influence. A lot of people put those Iron Angel records side by side with the first couple of Running Wild full-length albums, Gates to Purgatory and Branded and Exiled. They both have that similar style of being sort of, heavily influenced by like Hellbent for Leather era Judas Priest, but making it a little more intense, amping it up a little bit for the 1980s. Um, Iron Angel, also like Running Wild, somehow got a little bit of a tag of being somewhat satanic. Maybe because there was a demon on the cover of Hellish Crossfire, or it had the name Hell in it. They didn't really have a very strong, we're not talking 80s black metal here whatsoever, but they did sort of oddly get tagged that way, which happened to Running Wild as well. And they just happened to have the word Satan pop up here and there. Even though I don't have anything to show for Iron Angel, let's take a moment and check out a clip from one of my favorite songs by them off the second album, and this is the track Winds of War. Let's see what they sound like. Yeah, so there we go with Iron Angel and that Sea of Flames. Always like that tune. Good band. They, like many other bands, have come back around, gotten the band back together, and done some newer recordings. I have not checked any of those out, so I have no idea what they sound like these days, if they're playing a similar style or if the sound has shifted a bit. So, moving on from Iron Angel, I mentioned that wanted to give a shout out to one of the bigger name acts that sometimes gets bypassed by folks. And since I'm showing off some cool German metal records tonight, couldn't do it without mentioning this one. It's Accept's fourth album, Restless and Wild. Now, of course, everyone knows the name Accept. The problem is, I feel like a lot of people associate the band too much with, the one song, Balls to the Wall, and in the minds of, millennials and, Generation Z, Accept may be one of those bands they kind of write off as being a little bit too much on the, MTV party commercial friendly side of things. And yeah, Accept had some success in that avenue, but they also did a lot of really strong, very straightforward heavy metal stuff. It should not be written off just because they did have some success on MTV. I do not know the Accept catalog inside and out. They've made obviously a ton of records over time. This has always been the album, though, for me. Now, this is the original pressing cover with the flaming guitars. How much more heavy metal can you get from that? But there's a lot of other pressings and versions of it. The cover most people are familiar with is this one. It was released this way in the US and some other territories with the band on stage. Udo, of course, with a very unique, characteristic voice. This particular pressing's on Heavy Metal Worldwide, so a little different. And what's kind of cool about this pressing, it's not that it came in a snazzy yellow inner sleeve, which it did, but that it came on red vinyl. So yes, I kind of like the colored vinyls. So found this once upon a time and picked it up. But yeah, this is a real ass kicker of an album. It's got some of their best tracks on it. Opening pair of Fast as a Shark and Restless and Wild. That's just a killer combo to start an album out with. The album has some hits and misses along the way. It ends with a really cool song called Princess of the Dark, which is a little different for them, but works really well. We're not going to bother with a clip from Accept because A, most folks are going to know what they sound like, and B, that sounds like a copyright violation just dying to happen, so we'll take a pass on that. But bottom line, if you have not taken the time to check out Accept, or if you've always just had them on the list of one of those bands like, I don't know, Scorpions or something, not quite heavy enough maybe, give them a chance. Check out Restless and Wild in particular. If that album's not heavy enough for you, then I think you can bypass the rest of their catalog, because if Restless and Wild doesn't do it, yeah, probably nothing else that they did is going to either. All right, moving on from Accept to a band that tried really hard to sound like Accept, which, given the success that Udo's crew had, can't blame other bands for wanting a piece of that action as well. Got a much more obscure one here, though, with a German band called Stormwind. Always liked this logo a lot. Hey, we're heavy metal people. We obsess over things like logos, and I always thought this one was pretty cool. Stormwind made this album back in '85. It's called Taken by Storm. It's released on the Wishbone label, which is not one of the bigger outputs for heavy metal, but they did a few things. Fans of the German band Rage will recognize the name. Before Rage was on Noise Records recording under the name Rage, they did some stuff under the name Avenger, and those albums actually not bad. I kind of like them better than a lot of the Rage material I've heard. And like that first Rage the first Avenger, Prayers of Steel, was also on Wishbone. The deal with Stormwind, as I mentioned at first, they're trying a lot to sound like Accept. Very similar style in the delivery. The vocalist is doing a pretty passable Udo impersonation. But enough talking about it. Let's go to the tape and see what we hear. Let's see. This one I've got to jump over to a different sector and check out a little bit of the track called Striker.
Morning over, Phil, in cool surroundings, dirty destruction,
All right, that gives you a pretty good idea of what Striker's going for. Good, very similar to some of that early Accept stuff. Stormwind also did a 3-track EP, same year, also came out in 1985 on the Wishbone label. Cover art leaves a little bit to be desired this time, but they did get a little more vinyl product out there before sort of disappearing into the woodwork. Pictures on the back and that big kind of cool metal bird dragon looking icon mascot of the thing. This is another band that has, later on recorded some more stuff more recently. Haven't got around to checking them out, so I don't know what they sound like. But yeah, Stormwind. Not one many people have heard of, but if you like that style of very straightforward, early mid 80s German heavy metal, it's worth picking up if you come across. Not a particularly expensive record. It's not one most folks are familiar with or trying to hunt and track down. All right, next up, one of the real classics that gets overlooked is the band Brain Fever. Brain Fever did a couple of albums. This is the self-titled album. A lot of times it's referred to as Capture the Night, which, okay, if you want to call it that, that works too, I guess. It's on the old Mausoleum label, which if I remember right, it was a Belgium record label. They had some decent titles on Mausoleum over the years, although it was always considered kind of a second tier label. They never quite had the big name acts or quite the top tier distribution, but they had some good stuff. They released the Wolf Edge of the World album. Let's see, the fourth and last Witchfind album, Lords of Sin, was on Mausoleum. So yeah, I always found good selection of stuff on the label. Brain Fever did some albums. This one, if I remember right, came out around 85 for the self-titled, 84. And they had a single before this as well. Brain Fever's strength was, they can write some incredibly catchy melodic stuff while still having a very heavy chug to the music. And they have a really strong vocalist who puts in an excellent performance on their material. Let's take a quick listen to one of the tracks off of this called Danger in the Night. So yeah, that clip really showcases the strengths of Brain Fever. They just, keep those riffs just chugging along, but very catchy, very memorable parts to a lot of the tracks. And yeah, really, really strong vocal performance. Again, there are some misfires on the album. Not every track is great, but there's at least 4 or 5 just stone cold classics on that self-titled album. And they did one more album and also an EP before they disappeared for a while. This is the second album called Face to Face. A lot of folks list this one as superior to the self-titled. Personally, I like the self-titled a little bit more. There's nothing wrong with this album at all. It's, again, another very strong offering. Yeah, the band just did quality stuff. The EP I don't have. It has just the title You, Y-O-U, and a lot of people rave about the EP as well. I don't think I've ever heard the whole thing, so I can't really comment. But yeah, they had a very good run of material there from about 84 to 1987. The 7-inch single they did before the first album is a pretty hard item to find these days. All right, moving right along here. One of the more obscure and apparently harder to find German releases is a band called Adrian. Um, don't know a whole lot about them. They made this one album on kind of just a private press label. Oops, got it upside down there. This one came out in 1987, so just a little bit later. I'm guessing the name may be a reference back to the Running Wild mascot. Um, Perhaps. The name Adrian seems to pop up a lot in German metal. I always, of course, immediately think of Running Wild, but it may be tied to others. The band photo on this one is a little bit, check this out when you're going through the discount record bins and you're not quite sure what you're getting into here. And let's face it, this wasn't, winning any prizes at the arts fair either. Heavy metal dude with a gun, trying not to step on big pieces of cucumber and being attacked by a spider that is kind of just floating in the air in the fog. The art direction and photography might have had a few things that could have been improved upon, but the album's got some good tracks on it. Let's check out what's my favorite one from it, which is called Never Again. There's a prelude to this, and I think I cut this out, but if not, I'll probably jump through that. Yeah, let's get to the prelude. Here we go. All right, so there's a little good pounding speed metal for you out of Germany with Adrian. Again, the band didn't record anything else, haven't found anything else about band members going to other bands. And that's kind of been a theme for a lot of these things I'm showing off tonight. Germany obviously had a ton of bands, and they must have had a very deep talent pool because I don't find reference to a lot of these guys joining other bands or, going on to another act after their initial band, had its, one or two albums and then fell apart. So, but yeah, the Adrian album, harder one to find, but has some cool music on it for sure if you can pick it up. The copy I showed doesn't have the original inner sleeve with the liner notes and stuff on it. It was supposed to come with that originally. All right, couple more before we call tonight. Next up, one of the bands that is a little better known from the German scene, but not up there on the Halloween, Blind Guardian, Destruction tier, is the band Stormwitch. This is an old favorite, and a lot of headbangers, I think, will agree. Stormwitch has had a very long career, and this is where it all began, back around 1984 with Walpurgis Night. This is, again, very straightforward, classic German metal, and would fit in with a lot of the early stuff on Noise, like Running Wild, Gravedigger or Not. Something that always sets Stormwitch apart from a lot of the other bands, though, is they had a pretty strong sense of melody. The music could be very heavy, very fast at times, but it also had a pretty clean sound. It wasn't as rough or as gruff as a lot of the other bands out of Germany. Let's take a look, or a listen, rather, to one of the cool tracks on here called Werewolves on the Hunt. All right, there's a little early Stormwitch. Again, really solid German stuff. If you like the early noise records releases and such, you will like Stormwitch as well. They weren't on Noise, they were on a smaller label called Scratch Records that put out a few different bands as well. Now, again, Stormwitch had a good long career. They've released stuff, I think, as recently as 2018, with some hiatuses here and there. The only other one I have to show off is the third album, which is Stronger Than Evil. The Stormwitch catalog goes through some changes. Again, the song we just heard was from the debut Walpurgis Night. Really strong, solid, no kidding around metal. Second album is very similar to style to that, and it came out the following year in 85. 1986, they got the third album out here. This one is best known for having the track Raven Lord on it, which is a song that was covered by Hammerfall that sort of, got Hammerfall a whole lot of, true metal street cred points and but it did get a lot of people looking back at some of these 80s metal bands that people were forgetting about. Whether you like Hammerfall or not, they did revive interest in acts like Warlord and Stormwitch, bands that deserved another look. There are a lot of other good tracks on this album, though, as well. Rats in the Attic is a really cool one. Maybe I should have picked a clip of that to play, but can't go wrong with Werewolves. Other songs as well. Something that you'll, again, now, cover art direction. Guess which decade this picture was taken during? I'll give you 3 guesses, and the first 2 guesses don't count. It's very 80s. Something else that you hear them start doing pretty early in their career is they have a lot of songs that have kind of a little bit of a spooky vibe to them, but it's done from sort of a gothic horror sense. This is not a band that's interested in raining blood or being butchered at birth or anything. They're going for that really classic cinematic 1930s Republic horror serials type of horror. And you pick it up in a lot of song titles with things like, Dorian Gray, Jonathan's Diary, referencing Bram Stoker's Dracula, of course, things like that. You can also tell with the band pictures compared to the first album, they were rapidly evolving in a little different direction. Again, going a little more for that, faux fashion trend there. But again, the music on this one still holds up. It's still a very solid album, even if it's not quite as rough around the edges as Walpurgis Night. The album after this one, 1987's Beauty and the Beast, the title alone should tell you things are changing a bit. The band, really started playing more into, cleaner sound, but keeping that kind of gothic, romantic vibe about it. You'd still call it heavy metal, but you would say they're leaning pretty commercial friendly at that point. Not to the point they would ever get played on radio or anything like that, but it was getting to the point that a lot of heavy metal fans would start to lose interest, I think. It's not a bad album. Beauty and the Beast is still quite listenable because the band was always very good at writing these, pretty short to the point, 4-minute and change type songs that had enough hooks, they'd get stuck in your head a little bit. And basically, they found their niche of making these more clean-cut sounding songs that had, played into these, classic gothic horror tropes, and they took it and they ran with it and did several more albums of that ilk as well. They took a hiatus, they came back, they've made albums, throughout the 2000s here and there. I've heard some of the albums here and there. I haven't heard their whole catalog, but I've checked in with some. And again, they kind of stick to that formula. They know what works for them. None of them are the greatest thing ever pressed onto vinyl or a small, plastic, disc or tape or anything. But none of them are horrible either. I've never heard a Stormwitch album that I felt like was a waste of my time. So, decent band. If you don't mind a little, cleaner, more melodic, lighter sounding stuff, the later albums are worth checking out. If you only want the really heavy stuff, you should at least check out those first 3. All right, let's look at one last band for the night before we call it quits. This was an old favorite. Found out about it just thumbing through an old issue of Sentinel Steel magazine, Dennis Gulby's old zine. Sentinel Steel distribution is still around. Really good mail order if you don't mind digging through their really extensive online lists. Has a ton of stuff. And he just mentioned a few random. I think he had like an article just like 3 German unknowns. He mentioned the band Atlane, mentioned, don't even remember who the second one was, may have been Brain Fever, actually. And he mentioned this band called Not Fragile. That's the name of the band. It's also a vinyl record, so I guess it's technically Not Fragile. I'm guessing the band took their name from those, favorite Canadian sons of hard rock. No, I'm not talking about Rush. I'm talking about Bachman Turner Overdrive. Always liked a little BTO. If they didn't take the name from Bachman Turner Overdrive, well, they should have, because then there's no excuse for having such a crummy name for your band. Let's face it, it's not the best moniker. And no art budget. We're talking just like 0 art budget. Nothing at all. Just an NF kind of stuck together. I think it stands for no funds for the cover art. So yeah, you can see why this would have gotten overlooked. Not a good name, not a good cover. Checking out the pictures here on the back, this could easily be mistaken for a Bachman Turner Overdrive cover band. Yeah, that's a thing happening here. So how could this thing possibly be? This thing smokes. It's amazing. It's like listening to a bulldozer pumped full of crack running at 45 RPMs. It shouldn't sound like that. Nothing about this record says you're about to get totally pummeled with German, speed metal attack. And yet here we are. It is a really, really cool release. Now, it looks like it's kind of a full-length album with 8 tracks. It's a very short release, though. Again, there's a short intro. Side 1 has a 1-minute outro to it. Side 2 has a 48-second outro to it. So you really only get 5 full-length songs here. So it's pretty short and to the point. But yeah, and with All My Might, it isn't the only killer on here. High Into Heaven is also really good. The A side of this just absolutely is a skull crusher. The band did another EP the next year, around 89, I believe, for this one. The first one was on Mean Machine, by the way. This is on the Hellion Records label. It's called Lost in a Dream. Still no funds for the cover art. Sad. This one came on a lot of different colors of vinyl, and there's like 100 on orange and 100 on pink and 130 on blue or something. If you want the full rundown, you can check Discogs or Metal Archives, but Yeah, lots of weird colors of vinyl for this one. This one just has 3 tracks on it. Still very solid German power speed here. This one is not quite as crushing. It doesn't have that same pummeling heaviness to it as the tracks on Who Dares Wins. So, but still very solid. If like your German late 80s German power metal stuff, yeah, this is definitely still worth checking out. The band would go on to release a pretty long string of albums through the 1990s and into the 2000s. And again, it's a band where I've heard parts of the discography, haven't heard the whole thing. They always seem to have some good songs scattered here and there. The full-length albums, the ones I have checked out, and again, it's not all of them, it's always a matter of where it's like, okay, it's got a few good songs here, and then the rest are kind of average. So never been quite enough to want me to dig all the way through their catalog. But yeah, those first 2 EPs they put out, especially the Who Dares Wins, I don't care what the cover looks like. That is a stone cold smoker of a release. All right, I think that is enough German metal for tonight. I'll do another video sometime. We'll dig into the CD rack and pull out a few more of the sort of relative unknown Germans. But now let's continue talking metal in the comments down below. So what are some of your favorite sort of unknown German heavy metal gems? And again, I don't mean to always focus on the obscure stuff, but you don't need me to sit here and tell you that the first several Destruction albums are good. You don't need me to describe Halloween's Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 1 to you. Not Fragile. A lot of folks are not going to buy that if they see it in a used record bin and have no idea what it is. The picture of the drummer enough is that could make you just run to the hills and assume it's kind of some kind of pop rock album by itself. But I like to give some of these lesser known bands a shout out because there's a lot of good metal there to check out. Just have to know about it. So that's why we stick to those. So yeah, if there are some of these bands that you liked or didn't like, let me know. Leave a comment down below, and we'll talk metal some more. All right, with that, it's getting late, so let's wrap this up. Until next time, y'all keep banging your heads.